rather than reading 1,000 books one time, it'd be better to read 100 books 10 times. So, and I don't mean that to say that I would find 100 books that I put on my list and then never read any other books, but that I want this core that I return to and get more deeper value of that I would come back to.
One of the things I've realized is that our society is totally stratified by IQ.
One avenue that people like to use to get to know you is like, oh, what sports do you follow? And so if you say, I don't really follow any sports, sometimes they don't take that hint and they just keep talking to you about sports because that's what they were wanting to talk about.
Howdy. I'm Hannah Newich-Schwander, a production lead at a soybean seed facility in Central Illinois, and you're listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we sit down with my longtime friend, Rob Long, who returns to the podcast. Ever since Rob and I have had children, we don't get as much time to sit down and talk, so the podcast gave us a chance to just have a free-flowing conversation, which you're going to get to sit in on. We talked about how there's a new stock exchange opening up in Texas, how states are asserting their own rights. We talk about things like geology and what does it take to be one of the 100 books that goes on Rob's bookshelf. And of course, we do a deep dive into Bitcoin, but with Rob's extensive knowledge, we're going to talk about things in ways that you've likely never heard before. We'll get to that interview in just a moment, but I have two housekeeping things I want to share with you. First, longtime listeners of the podcast know that I do legacy interviews. This is where I sit down with an individual or couple to record them telling their life stories so that future generations can know their family history. Now, we get people from all over the United States and Canada to come do these interviews, and one of my favorite things happens about a day or two after the interview. That's when we get an email from somebody that describes what their parents felt like when they did the interview or how exciting it was. Just this last week, one of our clients wrote us and said, we picked up Dad and we had an 8-hour drive back to Iowa, and we have never heard him share as many stories as he did in that car ride. This warms my heart, and it's actually really similar to other feedback we hear, where after an adult has been asked to reflect on their life, they not only have a great experience doing the legacy interview and they feel great about what they have captured, but now they know that people want to hear their stories. So they share many, many more things with their families, and this becomes a change of pace around their family and home. If you're interested in having me sit down with your loved one to record their life stories and hopefully to get them to share a lot more stories with you, go to legacyinterviews.com to find out more. One other note, I have decided after my many years working in agriculture that I think there's a gap in the way that podcasting and news roundup is going. So what I want to start doing is recording a weekly show. I'm going to live stream it, and it's just going to be at first about 30 minutes. My hope is to capture a bunch of the news stories that are going on right now and how they are relevant to both people in agriculture, but what people living in the cities and suburbia should know about it. But I know that I actually am not the expert on this, so I've decided that I'm going to start inviting some of the podcast hosts of Ag's biggest and hottest podcasts. So you can expect on Thursday evenings between 6 to 6:30 that I'm going to start recording a live show that you can tune into live or listen to the next day. We've got a lot of details to work out, but we're planning on launching this on July 11th. So set your calendars for 6 p.m. on July 11th. All right, without further ado, let's head to the interview with Rob Long. Rob Long, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be back, Vance.
So we're longtime friends, but now as parents, we don't actually get to see each other anywhere near as frequently as we usually do. So a podcast is like one of the rare opportunities for us to sit and talk.
Yeah, it's a good excuse to sit down.
So when you look out at the world, I know you are focused on reading long-term things. You have your list of 100 books. What are you paying attention to out in the world that's strong enough to get you away from your 100 books?
Away from my books? That's interesting. Not a whole lot. You know, I do my job and I have my family, and then I read and kind of take care of my home, and that's about it.
What do you do? Like, if there's news that you're taking in, how do you do it?
RSS feeds. That's one. Long form stuff, as long form as possible, but it's hard to find good like, something that somebody sat on for months and improved and wrote and is, in depth, as opposed to just, hey, I heard this yesterday, I'm going to regurgitate this to you. I listen to podcasts, obviously, but those are not long form enough either.
Yeah, we belong to a small group where we can share messages, and when people in the group share something from Spotify, it drives you up the wall. What's going on there? Why do you hate that so much?
Because you have to be a subscriber to get to that stuff typically, and they could just unilaterally choose to remove any of that content at any point. That's true of anything that you don't own, but the beauty of podcasts generally is that it's a direct relationship between the producer and the consumer, right? Like, you publish your podcast, and the people who go and download it that don't get it from Spotify are downloading it directly from you or whatever server you say that you've stored the MP3 file at. But this centralizes the whole thing and gives a single point of failure, right? And kind of that's the, obviously it allows Spotify to monopolize this and pull it in. So it's easier to use. It's nice. The URLs are hideous. They're ugly. They hurt my eyes to look at, they're just garbled, awful, ugly strings. But, if you have a podcast, I want a link to the actual publisher as opposed to this intermediary that's making it available.
I remember RSS feeds were way more common in the past. There used to be that little bar, and I remember being orange, and you could just click on it. It doesn't seem like that is as common now.
Yeah, well, I think it's because there's just fewer people using blogs. Most blogs still support RSS feeds. They're really easy to do, really straightforward. It's just a little file that is, has little digests of your articles that sits on your website that an RSS reader will pull down and show you what's available. And then basically it's just a list of links of content. And then you go to wherever the original content is served. But after Google Reader was shut down in whenever that was, 2010 or something, it was a long time ago. That was kind of the one that most people were using at the time because it was really easy to use. It really went downhill from there. There are a lot of places that picked it up and do just as good. Like Feedly is out there. They're just as good as Google Reader ever was, but that's still hugely centralized. So there's people who still consume these things and do stuff that way. But if you stay in the walled garden of Twitter or Facebook or wherever else, LinkedIn, these places, that's where you find new content. And that's kind of the problem, right? It's being served to you by the algorithm. It's being chosen in relevance of some other method than what you care about, right? So I may have grouped my feeds into some, categories or something, but it's I have enough of them that I can just kind of look at them and scan around and see what I want to read and what's a priority for me. And that's how I do it.
Yeah, I think there's some level of discipline that I would love to develop in this way, because I noticed, so I never used to use the For You tab on Twitter, but now that it's X, I checked it out. I was all right, let's see what the algorithm on Twitter gives me. And I quickly found that it is detecting somehow likely what I'm copy pasting and saying, he wants to see a lot more of this. And so things that have made me chuckle, I throw a meme in with a group that I'm with. Well, now that, For You is just filled with these memes that are hilarious, but are putting Skittles into my mouth all day long. And it's hard to get away from it. Then you're all right, well, I need to clean up this algorithm by, clicking on other things. And it's just that every time you go to touch it, you're just making it worse, right? It's just getting worse and worse. So I would love to figure out how to have the discipline and the coordination or the organization of it to make it so I could choose the people I like and not be so much in the walled gardens.
I think I know what you'll say here, but my suggestion is just burn it down. Just delete your account, go away. I need to take that advice myself. I haven't logged into my Twitter account for months and months. I should just get in there and delete it. But if you don't have access to it, then you you can't use it,
Yeah, I mean, that's how I got rid of, like my desire to be on Facebook or these things. Like, you just stop using it and it goes away. I think like I'm definitely a person that likes new and novelty. So I need to find some way to get new information. And I definitely have podcasters that I don't want to go individually look like, oh, does this guy have a new podcast out? What I want is just to have it like, okay, this one's right at the top because it's.
But isn't that what podcast feeds are for?
I don't know what a podcast feed looks like. What do you mean?
I mean, it is literally an RSS feed, a podcast. Like that's the meaning of a podcast, is it's a list of episodes and it has a little link in there to the MP3 file that your player can understand and recognize that. So like, why do you need Twitter to tell you when there's a new episode when your podcast app tells you if there's a new episode?
Well, my podcast app is Spotify, right? And so then I'm logging into there to get them. And like, I think the one of the other challenges is like, at least when I was, for a few years ago, like when the transition went from RSS feeds to podcasts, or to like Spotify and these other Apple podcasts, these kinds of things, the players themselves, if you went to like lock your screen so you could put it in your pocket, now the player stops playing. And like, so there were all these attributes that the paid ones did that like the RSS feeds that I was using weren't doing. And so
I think you're mixing up podcasts and video, right? Like YouTube does this. A YouTube video, if you close the screen, it stops playing.
Unless you pay for the premium.
Unless you're paying for premium. But like, there are no podcast playing apps that I'm aware of that would do that, right? So if you're on Android, which I don't think you are, no. A good one that I use is AntennaPod. This is a open source app that you download that you just, it's a standard thing. You put in your feeds and you can import and export them as an OPML file and off you go.
I wanted Fountain to work, the one that gives you Satoshis for listening, and then like, as somebody putting them out, I'll occasionally get Satoshis for it, but it was just, it's not even as good as the ones I'm trying to get away from. So
it's hard to do, right? Because it has to be first a good podcast app before it does all the other fancy stuff with the Bitcoin payment stuff. So to me, it's just a non-starter, right? Like, and things would come out late through there.
Yeah.
I didn't understand why it wasn't just the straight RSS feed, but with the payment stuff built in. But
that's
I appreciate that they're doing something, that they're trying to break through and get money to go directly from consumers to producers. But yeah, it just doesn't work well enough.
I mean, that's my dream. And like, bravo to Fountain. I'm happy that you're out there. But that's my dream, is like, just let people pay only what they're listening to. Have it be such a small amount that they don't even think about it. You load $5 worth of, Bitcoin into your system, and then just let it slowly pay people out as you're listening to it. And when I'm, if I only listen to 5 minutes of a podcast, like, don't give them that much for it. That is brilliant. That's what I want. I think that's what rewards content creators, not for grabbing your attention, but actually keeping your attention and doing right by you. And it also pulls the model away from advertisers in an important way that I would love to see more of.
Yeah, and nobody can step in between there and say, we don't like this kind of content, and we don't think you should do that. Or, I wouldn't say it's censor proof, but it's definitely censor resistant, right? It's not easy to interpose between the producer and the consumer.
Man, if I think about just 1 year ago, the amount of stuff that's been going on with Bitcoin has like radically increased. Like Lightning has gotten better and better. I mean, I remember when Lightning, I think we were early on when you and I were on, Lightning was just getting started or just kind of just being known, and it's much, much easier to use now.
It's still the Wild West though.
Yeah.
It's still wild out there, and it's really hard, for example, to run your own Lightning node and do that successfully. There's a lot of weird aspects of that you need to be aware of, or you can get in a lot of trouble there.
Yeah, I started to take my Bitcoin node and then be like, oh, I'll also turn this into a Lightning node. And then I was like, no. There's like, I'm opening up a portal to the dark people that know a lot more about this than I do, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of Bitcoin, this has been an interesting time to watch, Trump has come out and said you can donate to me in Bitcoin. He said a few days ago, I want the U.S. to be the Bitcoin mining capital of the world. Texas has started really amping up on their energy generation in order for that. Seems like bullish for Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I would say the potential downside of this is that as it is politicized, if he supports it, then the other side hates it, right? That's kind of how this stuff goes. But it did seem like the Biden administration already hated it because they seem to not want people to use Bitcoin. They have very strange rules. For example, the SAB 21, the Special Accounting Bulletin 21 thing, which requires banks to hold the Bitcoin in 100% reserve, which makes perfect sense, except that it doesn't apply to anything else.
Yeah, you're not even allowed to have 100% reserve bank.
Yeah, you're not
dollars.
allowed to, right? But then on top of the 100, and that's just for the Bitcoin. And then on top of that, you have to have 100% of the dollar value of that Bitcoin also in reserve. So in effect, it's 200%, which just makes it feel like they don't want banks to ever custody Bitcoin for people, which seems like really the only way that banks could be relevant in Bitcoin, because it kind of eliminates the need for banks in a lot of ways. Without lending and that sort of thing, it doesn't do that. But so now there was kind of this softening where it seemed like they were indicating that they would not veto that bill. And then the weekend before the bill was coming up was when Trump went to the Libertarian National Convention and made all of these wild claims about, he's going to free Russell Ulbricht. He's going to, support self-custodying of Bitcoin and allow mining and, cut off the SEC's weird rule-making stuff. And then the next week, it was actually vetoed. They turned around on their thing of saying they would let it pass and then vetoed it. And I don't know why, right? But maybe they're like, well, we're not actually feeling any pressure on this now that he's doing it. Our people are going to go against it. So just, go ahead and do what you were going to do anyway.
Yeah, I think there's the potential for this huge politicization. And I saw that like as Trump put out some ad, that was very like Bitcoin branded kind of thing. And I'm like, ooh, he's like, I'm not on team Trump. I'm not on team Biden. I'm on team independent sovereignty, right? That's right. Like, whatever these guys are doing, they can go do their own thing, but it's not with me. But like the politicization of it is very dangerous. But on the other hand, the team that chooses, I'm not playing with Bitcoin over the long term is going to get themselves in a very, very difficult position. And so that position won't be tenable over the long arc of history, but in the short to medium term, it definitely could be a power wedge.
Yeah, and I think generally the way our democracy works, this will go away very fast. Like they will flip and become pro-Bitcoin, I think, in the end. If not pro-Bitcoin, reluctantly allowing it. I think if voters demonstrate actual preferences for people who support Bitcoin, then they will change. That's how it works.
The stuff that's happening, like it's like gradually then suddenly, that I think is very interesting is like Texas has seemed to deeply embrace Bitcoin. Like they're in the last couple of days, they've started announcing more energy projects, and then they're saying, Bitcoin is going to allow us to create the energy generation that we think we will need in the future for AI. But the difference between Bitcoin and AI is you need energy all the time for AI, but with Bitcoin, if you like all of a sudden need that energy because there's a heat wave going on and everybody's flipping on their air conditionings, now you can shut off the Bitcoin because the prices go too high. And so they were saying Bitcoin is going to be an essential part of making their energy base.
You can't do curtailment with AI, right? Where you turn it off and divert the power, sell it back to the grid instead of consuming it, because you have to keep it running, right? It's like a data center for AWS or any other big company that runs data centers. They need that power all the time. Like they're a good anchor customer, but yeah, if there's more demand, it's hard for them to slow that down.
Yeah, and then prices just go absolutely wild. But if you can build up a huge amount of energy And then that way, if you don't need it, then the Bitcoin can buy it and it can be used and then shut it off when it's not there.
Now, Bitcoin will always go and find the cheapest power generation, wherever that is, because it doesn't matter where it's located. So it allows you to locate the consumer right next to the producer, because the thing that's being exported is just digital, right? The actual blocks that you're mining, that you're signing, you don't need to have transmission lines where you have lots of waste or huge amounts of, wilderness that you're slicing this giant wires through or anything like that. You could put it on a remote island with a volcano on it and suck heat out of there and make power that way. It doesn't matter, So it'll just go to wherever it's the cheapest.
And this is one of those, like, when you have the realization about this, like being able to generate energy and then consume it right there with Bitcoin and then transport that Bitcoin somewhere else. This is like one of those things that when you grab the idea, I describe it as that sense of awe when you see like the edge of the universe, right? You're just like, oh my gosh, the potential of this is so far beyond anything I thought that I would get to when I started on this journey of learning about it. But it's also like one of those key blocks that fits into place in my mind of like, oh, this is so much bigger than just like, oh, I'm investing in Bitcoin like you are a stock. You're like, no, this is going to radically reshape. Now Alberta can have all their oil that they're not allowed to, their natural gas that they're flaring off of their rigs. Now all of a sudden they can turn that into Bitcoin mining and actually use that energy.
Yeah, the thing they're exporting is hash rate rather than the actual, energy
That's
itself.
A great way to describe it.
Right? So, that unlocks a lot of stuff around the world and really shifts the focus from, we have to find ways to locate the energy generation to where the consumption is, like big cities and, industrial concerns and these sort of things, to just go wherever you can most efficiently produce power. And that's it.
Yeah, because right now when they're creating energy, solar fields or wind farms, they want to put that right next to a city so that way the city because you generate the energy, you need to use it right now. We don't have the battery power. And what this is causing is outside of Chicago, instead of using all that land for farms, you're turning it into stupid wind farms and turning all the farm ground into solar farms because you're like, well, we want to generate it as close as we can to the city. Well, now you could go way out into the middle of the desert. There's nothing out there and start using.
Or in the ocean or something. I mean, just anywhere, right?
Yeah. And also I think it's going to bring countries online in ways that are really amazing. So I'm keenly interested in whenever they talk about Kenya and Bitcoin, because I lived there for a while and I have like a moderate understanding of how their culture and their economy works. And to think about like, one of the reasons that they haven't been able to do, large energy projects is they don't have necessarily a use for all that electricity, but you have to build the electric before you have the demand for the electric. You can't wait for the demand and then build the electric. You have to do it in advance. And Bitcoin gives you a chance to soak up all that extra supply. And then as people have more demand, then trade it off. It's like a great way to figure out the chicken or egg problem of energy.
It's like a developing economy, right? Where you have Bitcoin there as the anchor customer of that service. And then as things get built out, the demand for the electricity there will go up and the price will go up. And then the Bitcoin mining potentially moves on to some other place. And you're just left with people who are there consuming it as regular customers that Bitcoin doesn't want to compete with.
Yeah. And what do you think of the idea that people will end up having miners for things like heat generation, but then also a conversion of their
I know people are really excited about this, but I don't see this happening anytime soon. Like enthusiasts are doing it right now, right? Like for sure. But I think in terms of like, your grandma plugging in the Bitcoin, heat pump or whatever, it's just not going to happen anytime soon because those machines become worthless in a few years,
right?
In terms of their ability to produce Bitcoin. The network is constantly growing so fast, and your proportion of the hash rate that you produce determines how much output you get from every block that's mined. And as you go a year or 2 years, it just gets exponentially less and less and less and less. and yet you're still, doing this inefficient process to heat something up with electricity. It's like, yes, there's heat generated, and we can use that to do other things, but it doesn't seem to make sense to me in the short term. Maybe something will change.
Yeah, I'm hopeful on this. Like, I imagine somebody's machine shop, right? They can just have a walled off thing, because miners, if you've ever heard them, they are loud. They are really loud. But if you had a little place that you could, put in a cubby where you could block or dampen some of that sound and then just pipe it into your shop, that's good. But the cost of getting a new miner that keeps up with the overall hash rates.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, I think even over the long run, my guess is that it would always just be more efficient to just have a heating element and run electricity through that. And if you want to do Bitcoin mining, do that also. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a pull towards wouldn't it be nice, but it may not work. Going back to Texas, I don't know. You're always reading your 100 books, but have you seen that they've proposed starting their own stock exchange there as opposed to being in New York?
Yeah,
this is like, as soon as you say it, you're like, oh, I bet there are a lot of crazy regulations in New York on that stock exchange, and it would be interesting to see a state that is more leaning towards freedom. I don't know that Texas is like a libertarian haven, but it's more free than New York.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of inertia of finance in New York, right? Just because there's been trade and production, and it's kind of this cultural center, and has been for centuries. And that's why they're there. And it makes a lot of sense for the exchanges to be there. But definitely things are changing, and they've milked that. Like the bit license is one of those things that they instituted to charge anybody who wants to do Bitcoin or crypto, whatever, business in New York needs to pay this special license to do that. And no other state has this. It's just New York. And they can get away with it because that's where so much of the financial talent is. And so if you want to run a company to do that, it's beneficial to you to do it there. But I think Texas has a lot of potential. Like people have said, there's, deep water ports there. There's connections to, you're much closer to South and Central America. There's a lot of business to be done there. Miami gets a lot of that now. I think Texas, competes with that. And yeah, just different regulations. Being in a different place is a good thing.
Well, and like a lot of people moved to Texas recently, and the core of finance is not computers moving really fast, right? The core of finance is relationships, trust, creativity to figure out like what kind of deals are we doing, how does it all work? And so if you're living in a place that is just over-regulated, that is constantly coming in between two groups of people or two people wanting to make deals, eventually that highway robbery, that toll taker eventually starts having people say, well, we just aren't going to use these roads anymore. We're going to go somewhere else. So to me, like, to have a competitor to the New York Stock Exchange is awesome. And I also think that it pulls some of that centralizing power away from the East Coast, which I think is a good thing.
That would be an interesting to have a competitor to say, oh, well, where you're gonna go public, is your company gonna go to the New York Stock Exchange or the Texas Stock Exchange, right? Like that would be an interesting question. And would you see, would this be a further seam in the economy splitting along ideological lines, where it seems like this started with like credit card processing companies and various things that would start rejecting certain types of transactions and basically pulling political goals or outlooks into their business? You could see this further pushing that apart.
Has that changed? Did that go away, or did it just become so normalized that we just have forgotten about it? I mean, I remember for a while there was like, oh, we're no longer gonna process gun transactions. Right. You can no longer use a MasterCard to buy a handgun or whatever. Has it gone away?
I don't know. I don't know how you would measure such a thing. This is purely an impression that I have, but it doesn't feel like politics and business are unmixing at all.
No. It feels
anyway. This
maximizing. Yeah. I mean, I think that it'll be interesting to see what states try and align with places like Texas. Like, we definitely, I had a Chris Bennett on maybe a month or two ago, and we were talking about, if 10 years ago, the Texas governor had called for other states to send their National Guard to protect the border when the national government isn't doing it and they're going to be in conflict. This would have been like the most unthinkable idea you could possibly come up with. It wouldn't even seem realistic in a movie. And now it happened and went away, and like, you know, people are used to it. So like the next time that comes up, it's going to be so much easier for those things to happen rapidly than they ever did before.
I mean, it definitely seems like there's a block of states that have acted together, both with the deploying their National Guard to Texas, or if their attorneys general kind of joined together in lawsuits against the federal government for various things. That's like, you know, the kind of central states, right, from Missouri through Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma. Florida seems to be in that block. And then some states in the, you know, out west a bit. I don't know. It's curious to see how that goes. I don't relish the idea of that happening, but I think unless the states assert their rights to govern themselves, like they created the federal government, not the other way around, and it has all of its power granted to it from the states and the people, they will just continue to take it, I think.
Yeah, and it's horrifying to think about, like, what would it take to get political will around this? Like, there's like a possibility of it being like, is it going to be something big, right? Or will it be 1,000 little cuts that people just get fed up with it? But it definitely feels like we are headed towards a fracturing of states versus centralized.
I don't think it has to go that way. I think if the states could demonstrate value to their citizens by taking on solving certain problems that we perceive the federal government as not solving, then they could just gradually start assuming more and more things that they have a right to assume, right? I mean,
the only states that are going to have that power are the states that control their own budgets, like that have a budget surplus as opposed to a budget deficit. Because right now, the reason the federal government is so powerful is that they just can shower money on people for their public schools, for their interstates, for these kinds of things. And if you as a state can't keep up the infrastructure that you have, you're dependent. It's like the kid that needs his dad's money to survive.
Yeah. And I don't know anything about that. I don't know which states are net positive, net negative, any of that. I don't know.
Missouri's been good about it. I'm happy to see that. And I don't know that the whole state feels the same way that I do, but I think that there's definitely, Missouri has been very good about having a balanced budget. Some states require it, and other states just keep taking bonds out. And I mean, like the state of Illinois is so far in debt that they have to have some kind of crazy bailout in order to get out of whatever mess they're in.
Yeah.
100 books.
Yeah.
Have you ever taken a book off of your 100 list?
Just this year I started doing that. I started out with, so the idea, just to kind of set the table, is that rather than, there's kind of a quote behind this that is unattributed, that rather than reading 1,000 books one time, it'd be better to read 100 books 10 times. So, and I don't mean that to say that I would find 100 books that I put on my list and then never read any other books, but that I want this core that I return to and get more deeper value of, that I would come back to. And that's kind of the criteria for what goes on the list, is that it's important enough to me that I would enjoy reading it again multiple times. And so I started out with, 0 books on the list. So I kind of went through and added some books that I knew that I liked, that I wanted to come back to. And then over the years, as I read a book, I kind of take notes on things, and I keep it in a system called Obsidian, right, which is this note-taking app. And I kind of have some fields that I store, like how do I rate the book, what genre is it, the author, all that kind of stuff. And then one of them is a checkbox for whether it's in the 100 books list. So I just reached 100, a few months ago. So I have started taking books off the list to fit new ones on.
And is that just like scrolling through and being like,
yeah,
that one?
Yeah, it is that. I have like a rating, right? And I go from 1 to 5, what I thought about the book. And usually books on the top 100 are 4 and 5s. So I would kind of look for a 4 and see.
Oh, that's interesting, because eventually it'll hopefully all be all fives, right? If you read enough fives.
Yeah.
How would you grade the 1 through 5? What's that grading system look like?
I mean, 5 is like super, super good, the best book ever, and 1 is like just advise everybody I know to not read that. I haven't been real rigorous about that. That's just kind of a feeling.
And a 2, 3 is like, I wouldn't go out of my way to criticize it, but I also wouldn't tell anybody about it.
Yeah. And 4 gets you on the list, or considered for the list at least.
I know I've said this before when we've talked, but like I grew up in a house where my dad collected books, and you would think that people talk all the time like, oh, I wish I could have a house just filled with books. Well, I had that, and my dad, still in his 80s, still collects books, and I came to realize that most of it is noise, because you can't know what is in all of those books. Even if you read every one of them thoroughly, there's only a small percentage of the population that could be like, look at every single book and remember very clearly what's in there. And I became the type of person that was like, my rating system is probably like, if I dislike the book, I throw them away. I don't like go put them back into the world, which like really bothers some people, right? I don't have a book burning ceremony, but it's definitely like, I threw away a Yuval Harari book just this morning that was sitting in my house. I finally read enough of it that I was like, I can confidently throw this away, because I don't want other people reading it. Like, I don't want to propagate those memes, so I'm just not going to. And then I would say there's like an amount of books that are just going to go on a pile, but they aren't in the special shelf that I'm like, hey, nobody touch these. They should be exactly where they are. And then there's the like, I want other people to read this, so I'm willing to go buy it to give it out.
I mean, to me, there's a couple of different uses for the books. Some of them are actually references that I will go to and look things up that I remember, these are facts that I want to know. I like kind of given the analogy, it's really only meaningful if you know what a Bitcoin node is, right? But that every book is like running your own node for that book, that you don't have to go to some third party to either buy a copy of the book or look at a digital copy or listen to an audiobook, which they can and do edit, right? Like if you have an Audible book, that can change at any time, and they're not going to tell you what they edited out or why or anything. But if you have a book sitting on a shelf, that's what it is until the end of time, until it's destroyed. I like that aspect of it. But also, I feel like every one of those books, I want to be a portal to a conversation. Like I'm dying to have a conversation about any one of those books with somebody who would come to my house, come in my office and say like, oh, that's interesting. What's going on here? And I would say those are the books that if you want to have a conversation, a deep one with me about something, I'm excited to talk to you about any one of these things and, want to hear about these things. So that's kind of where I hope it goes. I don't know how much of that I really get, but
I mean, it's true. Like, you go look at somebody's bookshelf and it should stimulate a conversation. And I am a firm believer that if you have a book on a bookshelf, like, you should be able to talk about that book. And I had the experience, I went to visit my sister who's moved in with her long-term boyfriend in New York. He had a small bookshelf and I was like, this is glorious. I can look at the history of his mind and I can talk with him about, some of them are sci-fi fantasy, some of them are, Spanish literature, some of them are some of them I don't know anything at all about. So we can talk about that. And also the ordering of books is also very interesting. Like, how do people choose to put them together? There's something really can be autobiographical about that.
Yeah, I've split mine out into like fiction, nonfiction, philosophy, poetry, things like that. And then the one thing that's like, just to my eye, I hate the books that are just all random thicknesses and heights all over the place. So in each genre, I go from tallest at the left to shortest at the right. And so there's this like sawtooth pattern in the sections, and you can tell where a section is.
Aspy nature.
Exactly.
Speaking of, you were mentioning poetry, and this got me thinking, like, I have come to realize that I don't intuitively have the ability to rhyme and create this like melody that goes with poetry. And I didn't know this until I listened to my wife read children's books to our kids. And I would all of a sudden be like, oh, that book is not as horrible as I thought. Like, I was reading it and it seems so like stilted, but she could naturally find the rhythm of it. And I'm now like trying to get better at this, but I think it's a little bit like, if you don't learn colors at a young age, you're really only going to be able to distinguish if you like, you could get a little better, but you're never going to get great. But I have found that this may be one of the reasons why I've been very repelled by poetry. Plus the other reason is like, I'm always trying to read with speed, and
yeah, that's the exact opposite,
speed,
right?
Yeah.
You're trying to, your quality over quantity. And there are other channels of information in a poem than just the words that you're scanning through, right? Like, I mean, that's where it is contained in, but the pacing of it, the look of it, like on the page, how it is set up, with the spacing of everything, is trying to convey something to you ideally, and being receptive to that. It's fascinating to me. It's like just cramming more information into fewer words.
And I had optimized as a young kid for speed, and my ability to read a book and know what happened in it really high. But as you and I have discovered over long term, like, one, my retention of that information definitely falls off rather quickly. And I think like there's things that I just don't get in it. But when I was in grade school and my goal was to read literally every book in that library, which I did, right? Like the cost of it was that I was not paying attention to what was right in front of me.
Man, I read a book about a year ago, The Wizard of Oz, which, I'd never read that before. And it was fascinating to me that it felt so easy and comfortable. Like it's a young adult book anyway, so it's not like super complex. But the interesting part about it was that the action just proceeded forwards, and there was never any references to like previous things or like switching from one timeline to another, like where there's two parties and they're doing something and we're kind of going back and forth and seeing what happens. It just goes straight through this one fluid motion. And I think that's why it's easy for kids to understand, because it just kind of goes straight through and you don't have to pick up on subtleties or anything. And it was like, oh, that's interesting. It's just easy to read because of that, but yet still entertaining and good.
So I think I can relate. I just started reading my 3-year-old daughter, Black Beauty.
Oh, yeah.
And like there's something really soothing. First of all, Black Beauty, so far, we're a few chapters in, is awesome. It's an introduction to a little girl about like the pieces of a mane and like a bridle and like how does a horse get trained and what does it go through? Because the whole thing is, I don't know if you've read it, is from the horse's perspective of like what's going on around it. And like I'm so excited that we're just now beginning chapter books where Violet can take a chunk of information and then the next day stack something new on it. Whereas, children's books are about like, we're just going to read this one thing and then we may read it again and again and again, which was fine for the time. Yeah. But it's really engaging with me and her to have this relationship about like, then the next morning, well, let's tell Mom what happened to, Black Beauty last night. And there's something, I don't know, really great about reading children's books and kind of progressing along here.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like if you don't have children and you're not around them, reading the books is kind of, it's like, it's a little strange. But being able to see it through their eyes and read it and try to like advance them a little bit past where they're comfortable, this is a great joy. That's wonderful.
Do you have some children's books that you've enjoyed reading with your kids? You mentioned Wizard of Oz.
Boy, I would have to go and lately it's been my two older kids a bit. Like I have a very young 2-year-old who is still in little
rhymey
cardboard books, and then the older ones are read to themselves now. Lots of graphic novels and these sorts of things, and some chapter books. But so we're kind of in a no man's land, and I'm looking forward to that, like maybe 2 or 3 years from now when the youngest gets more into the chapter books.
We read every night, like it's just a part of the whole routine. And if I try and skip it because I'm like got a lot going on or whatever, it's just total disaster occurs. So you just have to do it. And there's There's a couple of children's books that I really like I don't know, maybe you've seen Ada Twist, Scientist.
Oh yeah.
And maybe you guys gave that to us, it's likely. And like there's that's a whole series of, but like imagine me reading these books not getting the rhyming pattern in it. I look back on the first few times I've ever read those books. But anyway, I really like that one. And there's Iggy Peck Architect, which is a really good one.
That sounds like it's in the same series.
It's in the same series, and it's all about Lila Greer's classroom and stuff. So
yeah. One of my hobbies that I've been engaged with for a long time is fossil collecting. So I'll throw this out there and just say that in St. Louis here particularly, we have an interesting place to do that. There's lots of interesting places across the United States and the world to do this, but the interest here is that we have this layer of limestone here that's from 300 to 400 million years old, and there's tons of things in there that are just fascinating to me, like that you could walk around in the middle of the North American continent and find seashells and crinoids and all kinds of interesting stuff. And the only reason they're there is that these animals invented this way to protect themselves that made them out of stone, right? Like limestone is calcium carbonate, and that's what they built their shells out of. And obviously that's why it's still here.
Whoa, I always thought that was in the reverse. I always thought that the limestone came from these little animals, growing up, bringing their shells, and then being crushed then over time.
That's right.
So they were taking calcium carbonate and turning it into that stone?
No, that's what it is. Like they are made of calcium carbonate. That's what they are. And then they die and they build up and layers of stuff forms. And that's where you get this, right?
Yeah, it's amazing to go out. I mean, I've gone out with you, and the first 5 or 6 times I was kind of like, here Rob and I are stepping on some rocks and looking down. But when you start to be able to discern a pattern, like, oh, it's right there. It's amazing. It's like a rush when you find one. And I'm sure as you go deeper and deeper, the rush gets.
No, and they're beautiful forms. I mentioned crinoids. These are things that are related to starfish and sand dollars. They're called echinoderms, and they have this 5-fold symmetry. So if you can picture a sand dollar, it has these 5 kind of leaf-shaped little, lobes in the shell there. And these crinoids, they look like a little Cheerio, a little kind of circular thing that you find. And I've found ones that are shaped like a pentagon, right? Like there are different species of them all over the place. And it's just fascinating to see what came out of this and kind of the variety that was around here. And that, 400 million years ago, we were in a shallow tropical sea, whereas right now we're in the middle of a giant continent,
And is that because like the temperature was just different, or was our axis to the sun different? Like how?
Yeah, I mean, when I say tropical sea, I mean literally, the North American plate was down under the equator at that point in time, and it has since moved to the north as, plate tectonics acts on the surface there. And it was shallow, right? Like, so there's a place south of here where there's this igneous rock that comes out, Tom Sauk Mountain. It's the highest point in Missouri, not super high, compared to anywhere else, but it's like 2,500 feet or something like that. And it's actually an old volcanic caldera. And at that time, it was an island chain that was there. And so it was just like a shelf, a continental shelf. So it wasn't a deep sea. The continent was still here, but the sea level was higher, and there was an ocean there.
As I think about this, I think like you have to have a certain amount of interest, like you have to be curious about this stuff, but then you also have to be able to model in your mind the way that the world looked, even when you can't see it, right? Like, so I don't know if you're looking at diagrams and you're able to build this model in your mind, or how that works.
Yeah, I mean, if you've studied geology, like in, maybe college or something like that, you see maps of what the world looked like if you turn the clock back, and you see kind of the continents Pangea, right? So the continents move around and agglomerate and split apart, and absolutely.
One of the things that comes to mind is that some of these activities that you're talking about require you to have a certain amount of like intellectual horsepower, right? IQ. One of the things I've realized is that our society is totally stratified by IQ, and that like a person can go, I think like this is kind of a touchy subject to talk about, right? Like I do not believe I have a high IQ. I think my verbal ability has like let me traipse around with people that are high IQ that I am not capable of. But I think like we are deeply stratified in our culture with people that have higher IQs and people that don't. And I think that this is one of the causes of a lot of our like societal strife going on right now, because I think we live in completely different worlds in a way that when we were a much more agrarian society, you had a bigger mixture and it wasn't so focused on rote IQ didn't take you that much further when what needed to happen was like the rows of crops needed to be hoed.
Yeah, I think though that the benefit that accrues to a high IQ is allowed by hiding how reality actually works. I think if we, structured things slightly differently, that it wouldn't shake out that way. That, yeah, you can, do intellectual tasks, but like the ability to make things change in the physical world is in the end much more important. And if your physical security, like we just take that for granted, that we're just fine driving our cars around doing whatever. But if there were roving gun battles happening in the streets or some kind of conflict going on, it doesn't matter what your IQ is. It matters how fast you are getting out of the way and seeing something coming.
Yeah, that's right.
We just don't typically have to deal with those things right now,
Yeah, that's right. And I think like the stratification of like the type of work that people do, and maybe it's not even maybe IQ is too like generalist of a term, right? Like it's because you need mechanical knowledge on how to make a car work. That's something like you could be high IQ but not be able to do that, right? There's some kind of like, how do I get these gears to work?
And I'd rather have a high IQ mechanic than I would a low IQ mechanic. I think it doesn't exactly segregate perfectly here, right? Like, I think smart people are smart in different ways.
Yeah, that's right. I think IQ probably is too barren of a thing. But the reason that I was thinking about this is, I think people in the bureaucratic world of corporations and things like this, they can live for days or weeks, months at a time without almost ever encountering somebody that has an IQ of 100 or below. So 100 is like the center of the Bell distribution. You know this, but like, so for people that don't know, if you have 100 IQ, there's 50% of the population has more than you, 50% has less than you. And this is a staggering realization because 100 IQ is about the type of work that I believe it's like an elementary school admin. You've got to be able to keep track of schedules and you have to know whose kids or what parents. It's not incredibly sophisticated. It doesn't have to be that complicated. So 50% of the population would not be capable of doing that job, or approximately 50% of that. And I think like most people in the modern world just don't encounter people that are below a 100 on a day-to-day basis, but that's more than half of the population.
Yeah, and if the economy becomes so rarefied that the only way to get value out of it is to be typing into a computer, doing kind of, very abstract things, then we're kind of over-specialized here, right? We need people to dig ditches and do real things in the real world. Otherwise, we're at the mercy of people who can actually do that. They can be denied us,
Yeah, I remember when I worked for a paving company and like a hardscaping company that would build these giant walls, like that could hold back a huge amount of earth. The guys working there, I don't think they were all that. They certainly weren't book IQ smart, but like the ability to create level ground in this weird Wisconsin soil and then be able to physically lift these blocks and keep everything completely flat and isolated. Like, I don't care if you're a high IQ programmer, you can't do that unless you've done it for a long freaking time. And we've definitely in our culture way vaulted this guy up and way pushed that guy down.
Yeah. So yeah, if you find yourself the person who's sitting at a computer and, you know, you hear the term "go touch grass" from time to time, you know, like go outside and encounter reality. You should feel a little alarmed if you don't have any connection to the real world outside of the computer.
Yeah, I was talking with a group of people. I was in a group meeting the other day, and people were talking about how expensive it was to plant a tree, and I'm like, it's really not that expensive. It just costs you a shovel, really. Like they were saying, you know, it's a percent. If you go out and buy a tree at like a tree nursery, and then you want them to plant it, they were like, and they charge a percentage of the tree to plant it, and you're like, yeah, well, the alternative is a shovel, and that's hard to do. And they were like, literally like, well, I wouldn't know what to do. And I'm like, well, let me tell you how this works. It's a hole, and you put it in the hole, and then you put the soil back around it.
I feel like once you get stuck, like I can see where that would come from. I've encountered people with this attitude, right? Of like, oh, I wouldn't know what to do. But like at some point you just have to jump over the chasm and just try to do something, right? And then you're like, well, I remember I did this thing I didn't know how to do last week. Maybe I can do it again this week, and just start building on that. I don't know.
And that's like, I think one of the most important things a parent can do is to like constantly get your kids to do things that they're like, because the easiest answer in the world is I don't want to, which is usually I don't know where to start, right? Like at least for me, procrastination occurs when I'm like, I don't know what the first step is. And so therefore I'm like constantly avoiding it because I haven't figured out what that first step is. So my method to get through procrastination is to be like, all right, let's look at this. And what would literally be the smallest step that I could take. And then once you take that step, you get it. But the world is bifurcated now in a way that I think the people that aren't touching grass don't have to do new things like that.
Yeah. If you've had experience of like, I need to fix something, right? Like an electric circuit or a mechanical device or something like that, and you've never done it before, it just seems like magic that, you know, somebody's like, oh, I wouldn't even know what to do, right? But it's just keep iterating on things like that and figuring out that you do act like they're human beings too. Just figure it out and do it.
Yeah, one of the best experiences I had was after I worked as a deckhand on a ship, I went into business with my buddy Court, and we bought a house and renovated it. And he would leave to go back on the ship to keep money coming in for our housing project. So I would go to Home Depot and buy, you know, electrical for dummies. Now, I don't know that I would want to live in a house that the guy that was wiring it did electrical for dummies. But all of a sudden you realize like all the systems in your house, except for the appliances, all the systems themselves are really, really simple, like shockingly simple. And once you understand just like what is the basic principle here, it's very, very easy to move things forward. But when you've never touched it, it all looks like very complicated.
I agree. This is an experience that I have from time to time where meeting new people, one avenue that people like to use to get to know you is like, oh, what sports do you follow? And so if you say, I don't really follow any sports, sometimes they don't take that hint and they'll just keep talking to you about sports because that's what they were wanting to talk about. I've had that happen several times recently. I'm like, I don't really follow sports too much, you know?
See, but you know, you're perfectly willing to be silent with another person. Whereas if a person came up to me and wanted to talk about sports and I was not interested, I would be more than happy to let them explain to me everything they wanted to about sports until we finally hit on a thing that I wanted to talk about, and then we would go in that direction.
Well, this was at a wedding reception. I was at a table with a guy, and you know, he was from Wisconsin. We were up there, and he was telling me about, you know, a golf course on the coast of Lake Michigan and how neat it was and all that sort of stuff. And I was like interested in that. But also this guy was a bartender. So he had an unbelievable ability to just talk, just make a conversation, you know, which you can imagine a bartender.
Yeah.
And he really just wanted to tell me about sports, not to talk about it, but tell me about it. So,
well, there's something that like, I think Ian, my wife, pointed this out to me of like, if we are talking about something I don't want to talk about, I'll ask you a bunch of questions until we eventually get to the point where I get to bring up the thing that I want to talk about. And it's a little bit like, come out here in the in the deep waters. Most of my conversations when I'm meeting, because I'm meeting a lot of new people because my daughters now go to this school, and so we're trying to meet more parents and everything. And ultimately, I'm waiting for my opportunity to be like, so what do you think about Bitcoin?
Right? Yeah, right.
And I've yet to have like that pay off, but one day it will, right? It's just like the podcast is the same thing. Like all the podcast guests come on here, and eventually, if you're a listener to the podcast, you know, like eventually I'm going to be like, so what do you think about Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, I work with tons of software developers and technical people, and even in that crowd, it's even not, you know, it's certainly not 100%, but probably less than 50% of people that want to talk about it or care about it anyway.
I mean, I think like there's like an alienating factor to it almost. Like there's something that people, it's not just that they don't want to talk about it. Like somebody doesn't want to talk about golf, or they don't want to talk about, you know, basketball or whatever. But like if you bring up Bitcoin, there's like a groan, there's like a, I don't, you know, that doesn't occur with other subjects. Is that because there's obnoxious Bitcoin people like me out there like forcing this conversation? Or
I don't think that's it, because I think they're probably they haven't had that experience because there's just not that many of those, right? But I think it's more of a like, it's a strange topic that nobody really, you either like, I don't, you know, it's weird internet money, yeah, that's just, they're like, I don't get it. I don't know why we're talking about this. Or it's a scary thing, like it's associated with, you know, money laundering or terrorism, or, you know, all of the FUD that's thrown out. But
or the people that are like, I wish I had gotten in on it, but I didn't get in on the big bump on it, and so there's like I missed out, and so now I reject it, or I had a chance to be a part of it, and I wish I had, but I just didn't.
Even that's a conversation, right? Because you can have that conversation, like, oh, when did you first hear about it? What did you know? You thought it was interesting that enough that you know about it. So like that's a great reaction. That's something you can work with.
When did you first hear about it?
Sometime probably 2011 or 2012. I'm certain that I bounced off of it at least the 3 times. That's the standard. You know, you hear about it several different times from several different ways before you really, you know, think of it as a real thing and consider doing something with it. So yeah, 2013.
Yeah, we were in a hookah bar, and I was like, Rob, give it to me one more time, when I had the like awe-inspiring moment.
Yeah. No, that was an interesting time, and that was a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, we were
11 years ago.
11 years ago. I mean, like so far before we had children, or you know, all the different things that happened. And if you were to say like how this game were to play out, you know, using the baseball analogy, what inning are we in?
Oh, I don't know. That's an interesting question. It depends on a lot of things, right? Like if you assume that Bitcoin itself as a network continues to operate the way it does, you know, you can look at it in its own terms and say that it will continue paying out for every block until 2140 something, you know, like 100 years from now, 120 years from now. But in terms of like the human uptake and use of it, I think it just depends on what happens else in the real world, right? Like if the dollar were not losing purchasing power so rapidly over time, I don't think people would feel so excited to go use it. It would be an interesting curiosity. It'd be like, oh, it's like email for money or something, you know, this kind of thing. But as it is, the store of value is a pressing, urgent need that we have. So I think it's not good. It's not good that we need it. It would be nice if we just had a normal, you know, currency that didn't dissolve out from under us. But I don't know.
I like the term epoch for this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I think there was an epoch before you got in, right? Like, you know, where it actually started, and there were people doing it, you know, for like 3 years or whatever, 4 years. And then I think there was like the early adopter epoch, right? Where there's people that are like, I wasn't in at the very beginning. And now I think we're probably in the third epoch where like all of those people are in, and now it's going to more. I don't know that the like normal technology adoption curve that you see everywhere is.
I think it's exactly that.
Is it?
I think there's the early adopters, right, and then the enthusiasts, and now we're into the first large chunk of the. This is the Crossing the Chasm book, right? That has this normal distribution, and then the first bit of it are the people who invented it and the people who are just super enthusiastic about it because of the technology or whatever. But there's the I forget what the bulk of it is called, but basically the first half of the normal distribution coming into it. And I think right now you have the ETFs that allow people who just have money in 401ks to buy into it in this way. It's not exactly Bitcoin. They have exposure to the price of Bitcoin is what they have. They don't have the Bitcoin. The ETFs have the Bitcoin. But I think once they see that and then kind of understand what's going on, the next logical step is to take self-custody of that Bitcoin. And especially if you have, legal reform that makes that explicitly something that we have the right to do. I mean, we already do, right? But I don't think the government necessarily agrees with that. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot more people that own crypto, and I'm being very specific in saying that as opposed to Bitcoin than I originally thought. I mean, it's like not an insane. It's like tens of millions of people. So it's a lot of people.
Yeah.
But there's still so many more. I mean, billions more people to go.
Well, I mean, the estimate that I've seen is that it's on the order of 50 million people in the United States that own some form of crypto, which I believe probably most people who own crypto also own Bitcoin and maybe something else. So that's a solid block. And if they demonstrate, voting preferences based on promises made and delivered on, keeping that free and unencumbered, then I think that'll change things for the good.
And I think we'll also not hear about things that are going on in other countries. I mean, like in the U.S., there's like, I remember when you and I were first, we actually gave like, I don't know, I won't call them classes, but like little intro lessons to Bitcoin. And I can remember talking about wild hyperinflation. Like imagine living in a place that has hyperinflation. And after one of the things you were like, hey, don't use that example anymore because the people here like literally cannot imagine what hyperinflation is like. They don't even have a perception that inflation is bad. They don't. And then like, fast forward 10 years, I think there's nobody in America that doesn't now know the experience of having your money go down in value. They just don't have they don't connect Bitcoin with being a way to get out of that cycle.
Yeah, I was listening to a conversation. I don't remember if it was Representative Massey talking to somebody, and it was not Tucker recently. It was Tom Woods. That's what it was.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
On the Tom Woods podcast.
Okay.
He was saying that every year that he's been up there, he puts in a bill to abolish the Federal Reserve, and that it's usually like it's like a joke. It's just him and one other person that signs on to it. But that in like this year, there was 25 other representatives that signed on to it, which is not going to pass. It's never going to pass, right? But the interest has gone from literally zero to a little bit more. And that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think libertarianism as a concept of like freedom is growing, but the idea that the Federal Reserve is something that you could abolish is something that like it wasn't even on people's radars, because like if you go to Washington D.C. and you see the building that they like term as the Federal Reserve, you're like, this is just the government, right? They don't. And you and I actually used to live down the street from a guy that worked at the Federal Reserve, and he would always make it very clear, like, oh, we're not government employees. It doesn't say .gov at the end of our email. I
don't know how that's supposed to be comforting, by the way.
Yeah, right.
Like, yet you still have this power over our currency. So
it's wild. So like, it's difficult. I don't even know that I actually know the correct answer here. They're a private company.
I don't know the answer, right? Like Clearly the president appoints or the Congress, I don't know, somebody appoints the Federal Reserve chairman, right? But banks own shares of stock in the Federal Reserve, like the big banks do. I don't know what they own. What is it that they actually own? What do they get out of those shares? I don't know.
Yeah, and do they get paid a dividend off of that? Like, or is it just that and what is that? And like the relationship between the Treasury and the Fed, like there's that famous video.
These are all questions that have answers, by the way, and I just have not looked them up, right? So I'm not saying this is a mysterious thing that we just don't know. My point in this is to say, I don't know the answer, and it's confusing, and I don't know where I would look exactly, like who I would trust to tell me the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, and like you can find people like Jeremy Lacoste, who's been on the podcast several times. He'll talk to you about like, well, the Treasury, what they do is they go borrow money, they issue notes, and then they can use those notes to get the federal, like, but as soon as I start digging into it, he's somebody that I trust. Like, I'm just like,
yeah,
but like, why would you do that? And ultimately it comes down to, this is some kind of symphony created by I don't necessarily mean a good symphony. I just mean like, it's just music created by people. Mm-hmm. And so it's not like physics where you're like, oh, there is a natural order to this. It is an order created by human beings. How is Nostr?
Good. I use it every day.
Talk about Nostr. That's actually a great subject.
Yeah, it's a tricky one to talk about because it's very young. It's very much talk of protocols and programming languages and this sort of stuff. But the concept of it is to create a system where I can produce messages and they are relayed to people who wish to consume them, right? And that this message is cryptographically signed, not hidden, but authenticated that I'm the one that produced it, such that I could sign it with a private key. You know my public key, so you can take my public key and say, oh, does this verify? And say, yes, no one else could have signed this message but Rob, who created it. And the purpose of that is to just allow communication and to create what we would call a web of trust. So if I trust your public key, and I trust other people that I know personally and say, okay, I understand this is this exact person's identity, that if somebody new comes up and I know somebody else that I trusts that person, then I'm much more willing to listen to them, do business with them, whatever. I'm much less likely to be scammed by some, random nonsense going on. Or there are a whole lot of other uses for this. A lot of the most popular one is as a replacement for something like Twitter, where people post messages and respond to one another and like things and do that. To me, that's not the most interesting use case of this. It really is just the messaging part. I'm interested in essentially migrating podcasts and RSS feeds to this format so that I don't even need to go to a single website where that could be taken down. I could just go to any relay that relays Nostr messages and find what I'm looking for there if they've published it there. So it's kind of it decentralizes the distribution even further, and yet at the same time, cryptographically ensures that what I'm receiving has not been edited in flight by somebody.
Let me see if I can repeat this and if I got it right. Because I've been on Nostr a little bit, but it didn't hold like immediate value to me, so I didn't hang out in the same way. And it's like very clunky because it's written by people for people that know how to do this, but that everybody has their own key that allows them, just like Bitcoin. You have a public key and a private key, and the public key says, hey, if you want to send stuff to me, send it to this address. And the private key is the thing that you sign that makes sure that if I send you a note, it's actually from me. Somebody didn't like get in the middle and, because on Twitter, Elon could jump in there and send messages from Vance's account.
Yes.
And it might look like it's coming from my account, but it's not. Or Gmail, the same thing. But this one, it would be you're much more secure in the sense of you're sealing that it's going from one person to another, and my seal is on there. The information gets stored on relays, which are essentially like servers at somebody's house. So I could say or wherever, but if I had one at my house, I could say, of the information that comes to my node, I want to save some of it on this relay so that other people could access it as well.
Yeah, not exactly. So a relay is just more like a server, and a lot of them now, when we first started out, like when I started out, there was like, I was aware of 100 other people using this thing. There's been, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people signed up and used it since then. But the idea is that it's just an open place, like a URL. So it might be, relay.damus.io, right? Which is a notable Nostr app. And so when you publish a message, you have a list of relays that you use, and it just sends your message to all those relays. So anyone who is listening for messages coming from me and is also talking to that relay would receive that message in real time, or whenever they connect to it. It's stored there. So it's like, I put it out here and anyone can come and read it at any time. And then since it's gotten more popular, there are a lot more relays that will charge an amount of Bitcoin for access to that relay, for the ability to write things to the relay.
Oh,
generally you can read from them, but if you want to write to them, you gotta pay a little bit through the Lightning network of Bitcoin.
That's an inversion of the way we put up content now. Right now, the content is, hey company, I will give you this stuff for free. I'm just going to give it to you, and then maybe if you get some advertising dollars or you like what I'm doing, you'll give me money back, but not I'm going to pay to post here. That's like...
Right, because it's there to disincentivize spammers and people just want to make mischief, but they don't want to pay money to make trouble. And if the rate is high enough for the spammer, it's not worth it,
Wow. Okay.
And it seems to work.
Is it that it works because there's money there, or is it because there's just not that many people on Nostr and it's a bunch of...
There's enough pranksters out there that loves, trying to test the system, that they're absolutely happy to do that, right? You can pay and spam everybody, but you don't typically see that. So I think it works well. And if the customers on that relay became so valuable to a spammer that they would be willing to pay, then I think that would be a signal that you should just raise your price.
I mean, that's exactly what I want going on with my email. Like, right. I want like, if you want to send me advertisements, just attach a little bit of money to that, and I'll open that thing up, and that'll make it so you are going to make double damn sure that I am going to value whatever it is that you put in there.
And probably people who want to advertise would also appreciate that, because they are right now paying that fee. It's just not going to you. Right? They're paying the post office, or they're paying Facebook or X or whoever.
Well, that's exactly right.
To get access to their customers. And then they're just taking all of that money and giving you the, ads that show up, as opposed to just saying, like, you set the price, set the slider bar where you want it. And if you read it, then the money comes over to you. Why not?
Seems fantastic. So what do you use it for that's outside of, if you don't... Because I initially got on and tried to use like basically the Twitter version of this. This is before Elon bought and turned it into X. I was like, I got to get out of here because I'm
still on that train. I don't
think Elon's anything special.
But
he improved it for me.
I do use apps that, like, I don't use Damus. I use something called Amethyst, which is the Android client that acts in a roughly similar way. But the other use case that I'm specifically working on, as I said, is the RSS feeds / podcasts migrating as a Nostr feed instead of an RSS XML file feed. And I've built some stuff that I'm working on getting out there where, so if you have an app, like I mentioned Feedly before, if you use something like that, you can kind of go into the settings menu and say, export my feeds. And what it will give you is a file called an OPML file. And it's another XML file. And it's just a list of all of your feeds, right? And so I've wrote this software that will take and parse that file and push all of those things into Nostr. And then you can go and kind of mix and match. So I have my feed up there. And if you uploaded yours, I could see what you have up there and say like, oh, Vance has this category called Bitcoin and it has all of his long form content that he follows about Bitcoin. I'm just going to click this button and add that whole list of feeds into my feed, right? So that then I could export that file and import it into an RSS feed reader, or what I'm working up to is just reading it through the site there itself, as opposed to importing and exporting things all the time. But I'm trying to keep it very, very simple because it can get wildly out of control.
I mean, I can tell you that I would personally love to be able to look at like, what's Joseph Ring listening to these days? What's, Mike Compton checking out these days? What's Eric Ward up to? And not having to be like, hey guys, flip me and in particular, if there was a way for them to rate, of the things they've listened to, how would you rate this?
Yeah.
And then just like
look at it.
That would be fantastic. That would be infinitely more valuable than the algorithm giving me this, because it would be a curated list from people that I trust.
Right. And that's kind of the beautiful part about Nostr is that you show up and like it's not the same thing as saying, well, Twitter is a platform, right? Like it's an application and the people you follow and who follows you is entirely trapped inside of that one application, inside of that platform. Nostr is a protocol, and there are many applications that use that protocol. So it would be like if you left Twitter and all the people who followed you and you follow are all still there, but you went to some other application, like let's say Spotify, right? And you wanted to say, who are the people that I follow? What are their podcasts that they listen to? You could do that. Like, this is the idea. That's what
I mean, that would be so empowering to the individual, because then it strips out that ability to take your followers somewhere, which is like it's just like, who are people that like the content you curate, and can they still get access to the content you curate, or do they have to, like, I love this.
And it's not like technological wizardry. It's just coming up with a protocol that everyone decides that they agree that will use that, right? Like, because it's like Tower of Babel. Everybody's doing it in a different way. I mean, partly because they don't want to share this, right? Like, you don't want to give somebody an exit if you have like this captive market, and that's part of the point of it. But also, it's just, we don't have a standard for this. So this is an approach to a standard. And if somebody comes up with something better, I'll use that,
So what's the on-ramp to Nostr?
Probably using the normal, like, Twitter social media type client apps, like either Damus, DAMUS.io. That's the iPhone app, or
as a Nostradamus.
Right, Nostradamus. I say Nostr. Some people say Nostr. There's 10,000 ways to say it. It's a terrible name, but like all things in computers, it is cursed to have the first name it was given was a joke by the developer, which is always how it works. And then it just sticks, and nobody can think of something else because
that's just what it is. Yeah.
And if you're on Android, I would say use Amethyst.
Okay.
Which is a similar type of app. Yeah.
Well, it's very easy for me to carve out some amount of time that I'm giving to the apps to be like, all right, instead of doing that, I'm going to jump over here and try and get back into this.
And if you were around in the early days of the internet, you'll know that the conversations and things that were happening there were almost entirely about the thing itself that they were just building. And that's also the case here. And for 99% of people, this is like boring. I want to hear about some other thing, but like, that is exactly what I want. So that's, so it's the perfect place for me to talk to people and do this. But, as it grows, it will change and do all sorts of different stuff, but it's a thing to watch.
I know, so I'm interviewing the guy that runs the Survivalist podcast, very popular, and he's very into Nostr, and I think that it's probably selecting for people that they say, well, you may not be able to see the censorship and the control and the walled garden that's around you, but it exists, and so I'm building over here. And if I could find a way to get involved with your podcast thing and see that curated list of my friends, I'm totally game. And if we could find a way to replicate Slack outside of Slack, that's the holy grail for me.
Yeah, no, there are people working on that. There are communities. There's all kinds of improvements that happen over time. It's so early. in Nostr. People come up with concepts. So in Bitcoin, like they've been adding features since the very beginning, right? They're Bitcoin improvement proposals, BIPs, right? And there's like 400 of them now or something that have been, proposed and approved in various stages. And there's a similar kind of thing in Nostr, and they just keep adding functionality to it. And if you're out there and you're a developer, even if you're just learning how to develop, software developing, this is a really, really fun thing to work on because it's just dead simple. But the core concepts of computer science are here, like, a hash function, encryption, all these sorts of things, and kind of the web development that's really popular out there that people have some basic skills in is all useful in this place. But it's a lot more focused and interesting. You can do surprisingly a lot of stuff. So if you're even remotely interested, just go play with it. It's all JSON blobs. This means something to you if you're a developer. It's all JSON, and they're just, you're signing them and sending them and receiving them and processing them. So if that means something to you and you're curious, go check it out.
Well, great, man. I'm glad we caught that last little bip in there. I think we talked about Nostr one of the other times when you were on, but I think this is a much better explanation than I ever understood before.
No, that was good.
Well, thanks, man.
Yeah.